They started watching Naomi Mercer less than 30 seconds after she walked into the boutique, and by the end of the afternoon, federal compliance seals would be hanging across the front doors while terrified employees stood frozen behind the glass. Rainwater dripped softly from the hem of Naomi's olive trench coat as she stepped into the luxury store on Madison Avenue, her white sneakers leaving faint wet marks across the polished marble floor. The boutique smelled like jasmine perfume and expensive leather, the kind of place where silence itself felt expensive. A young sales associate glanced at Naomi once, then twice, before leaning subtly toward another employee near the handbags. The whisper was quiet, but not quiet enough. "Keep an eye on her." Naomi pretended not to hear it. She simply adjusted the canvas tote bag hanging from her shoulder and walked deeper into the store beneath the warm golden lights. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was still damp from the rain, slightly frizzy near the ends, and there was something exhausted about the way she moved. Not nervous, not lost, just emotionally distant. The kind of woman people overlooked until they looked too late. Near the center display, another associate immediately approached a wealthy blonde customer wearing diamonds and a cream cashmere coat. Champagne appeared within seconds. Smiles widened. Compliments flowed effortlessly. But when Naomi paused beside a limited edition leather jacket displayed beneath a spotlight, nobody greeted her. Nobody offered help. What they offered instead were eyes. Constant eyes. Security near the entrance adjusted his earpiece while pretending to study his phone. One employee folded the same sweater 3 separate times beside Naomi without saying a word. Another circled slowly near the fitting rooms, watching her reflection through the mirrors. The pressure built quietly, socially, surgically. Naomi ran her fingers lightly across the sleeve of the jacket. "Excuse me." A sharp female voice interrupted instantly. A tall store manager with slick blonde hair stepped between Naomi and the display with a polished smile that never touched her eyes. "That collection is reserved for private clients." Naomi looked up slowly. "I was just looking." "Of course," the manager replied smoothly, though her tone carried something colder underneath. "We simply like to protect certain merchandise." 2 nearby customers glanced over. One man smirked faintly before turning away. Naomi noticed it. She noticed everything. The manager's eyes dropped briefly toward Naomi's damp sneakers and oversized tote bag. Perhaps our seasonal section downstairs would be more accessible. The humiliation landed softly, professionally, exactly the way luxury cruelty often did. Not loud enough to cause a scene, just sharp enough to make someone feel small. A hush settled across the boutique as Naomi stood there under the spotlight, surrounded by mirrors, watched from every angle like she had already done something wrong. Then one of the younger employees leaned toward another and whispered the sentence that would quietly destroy the entire store before sunset. "She doesn't even look like she can afford the zipper." The young employee's whisper spread farther than she intended. Naomi saw it happen in the reflections first. One sales associate stiffened near the register. Another glanced toward security. The manager's polished smile sharpened almost imperceptibly, as if the entire store had silently agreed on what Naomi was supposed to be before she ever opened her mouth again. Naomi slowly let go of the leather jacket sleeve and slipped her damp hands into the pockets of her trench coat. "I am looking for a gift," she said calmly. The manager nodded with exaggerated professionalism. "Of course you are." The tone carried just enough disbelief to draw attention from nearby shoppers without sounding openly rude. That was the brilliance of people like her. They humiliated quietly. A couple standing near the shoe display turned to watch more openly now. One woman lifted her champagne glass slightly and murmured something into her husband's ear. He chuckled under his breath while staring directly at Naomi's tote bag. The social pressure inside the boutique thickened like invisible smoke. Naomi noticed a younger employee nearby beginning to look uncomfortable. The girl could not have been older than 23. She kept pretending to rearrange scarves while avoiding eye contact with everyone. "Would you like me to show you something from our entry collections?" the manager asked. There it was again. Entry collections. The verbal equivalent of being escorted toward the cheap section without actually saying cheap. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "I asked about the jacket. That item starts at $11,000. The manager replied smoothly. "We usually schedule appointments before showing pieces at that level." A silence followed. Not accidental silence. Expectant silence. The kind designed to make someone explain themselves. Naomi could feel the boutique waiting for embarrassment to happen, waiting for discomfort, waiting for her to either leave quietly or prove she belonged there. Instead, she simply asked, "Do you normally decide who can afford something based on wet shoes?" The question landed harder than the manager expected. One customer looked down immediately. Another employee froze mid-fold beside a display table. For half a second, the manager's smile slipped. Then it returned colder than before. "We prioritize client relationships here," she replied carefully. "Luxury retail requires discretion." Naomi studied her for a long moment. Not angry, not emotional, just studying her the way someone studies structural damage before a building collapses. Then Naomi glanced subtly toward the mirrored wall near the entrance where security had stopped pretending not to stare. "Interesting," she said softly. The manager crossed her arms. "Excuse me." Naomi looked back at her. Nothing. But something had changed. The tension inside the boutique no longer felt social. It felt procedural. Quietly procedural. Naomi reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small black notebook worn at the edges from years of use. She wrote something down calmly, while 3 employees watched her with growing unease. Then, without warning, the store's front doors locked automatically with a heavy metallic click. Several customers turned in confusion. One associate blinked toward the entrance. "Why did the doors just lock?" someone asked. And 4. The first time since Naomi walked in, the manager looked genuinely nervous. The metallic lock echoed across the boutique louder than it should have. Conversation stopped almost instantly. A woman near the perfume counter lowered her champagne glass halfway to her lips, while another customer glanced toward the entrance with visible irritation. "Did they just lock us in?" someone asked quietly. The manager recovered first, though the confidence in her face no longer looked effortless. "It is probably a security protocol," she said, forcing a smile toward the customers. "Please continue shopping." But nobody moved. Naomi remained standing near the leather display with the small black notebook still in her hand. Rainwater continued dripping softly from the edge of her trench coat onto the marble floor beneath her feet. She did not look surprised by the locked doors. That detail alone began changing the atmosphere inside the store. The younger employee noticed it first. Her eyes shifted nervously between Naomi and the manager. "Claire," she whispered carefully, "maybe we should call regional before this becomes..." The manager snapped a sharp look at her. "I said everything is fine." But it did not sound fine anymore. Near the entrance, security pressed a hand against his earpiece, listening intently now instead of pretending to. His posture straightened. Then came another sound. The elevator at the back of the boutique opened with a soft mechanical chime usually reserved for executive access upstairs. Every employee looked toward it instinctively. 2 men in dark suits stepped out first, followed by a woman carrying a tablet against her chest. None of them wore store branding. Their expressions were controlled, professional, unreadable. The manager's face lost color immediately. "Oh my God," one employee whispered under her breath. Naomi closed her notebook calmly. The woman with the tablet scanned the store once before her eyes landed directly on Naomi. "Ms. Mercer," she said respectfully, "we apologize for the delay." A cold silence swept through the boutique. One customer slowly lowered his shopping bag onto the floor. Another looked back and forth between Naomi and the arriving executives as realization began spreading in fragments across the room. The manager blinked twice. "You know her?" The suited woman turned slowly. "Know her?" she repeated carefully. "Ms. Mercer was appointed by Halbrecht International this morning as lead external compliance auditor for all North American flagship locations." Nobody spoke after that. Even the background music suddenly felt too loud. Naomi slipped the notebook back into her canvas tote. "I asked for observational discretion," she said quietly. "I did not expect your staff to escalate this quickly." The manager's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The younger employee looked physically ill now. One of the executives approached the entrance and held up a document toward security. "Per corporate authorization, this location is temporarily suspended pending discrimination review and employee conduct investigation effective immediately." The words landed one by one like falling glass. Customers began murmuring nervously. A woman near the register stepped backward in disbelief. "Wait," the manager said suddenly, her voice cracking for the first time. "There has to be some misunderstanding." Naomi looked at her evenly. "You made your conclusions very quickly earlier," she replied softly. I am surprised you suddenly need more information now. The room went completely silent. Not dramatic silence. Worse, the kind where everyone realizes at the exact same moment that the person they humiliated had been quietly holding the power to destroy everything around them from the second she walked through the door. The boutique no longer felt luxurious. It felt exposed. Employees who had moved confidently across the marble floors minutes earlier now stood stiff and pale beneath the warm designer lighting, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid to move too quickly, afraid they had already said too much. Naomi watched the panic spread with the same calm expression she had carried since the moment she entered the store. That calmness unsettled them more than anger ever could have. One executive quietly handed folders to the compliance team, while another began photographing displays, terminals, and employee stations with clinical precision. The soft clicking of tablet screens replaced the boutique music that had suddenly been shut off completely. The silence afterward felt almost sterile. The manager swallowed hard and stepped closer to Naomi, lowering her voice. Ms. Mercer, if there was any misunderstanding today, I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss it privately. Naomi looked at her for a long moment before answering. You had the opportunity earlier. The words were not cruel. That made them worse. Nearby, the younger employee who had warned the manager earlier stood frozen beside the scarf display, her eyes glossy with anxiety. Naomi noticed her immediately. What is your name? The girl blinked in surprise. Emily. How long have you worked here, Emily? 8 months. Naomi nodded slightly. You were uncomfortable when this started. Emily hesitated, glancing nervously toward the manager before speaking. I just thought maybe we were being too aggressive. The manager's face tightened instantly. Emily, this is not the time. But Naomi interrupted softly. Actually, this is exactly the time. Another heavy silence settled across the room. Customers who had once looked amused now avoided eye contact entirely. A woman in pearls quietly set down a handbag she had been planning to purchase. A man near the fitting room slowly removed his phone from his pocket after realizing he had been recording part of the confrontation. One of the compliance officers approached Naomi with a tablet. We already found 3 prior customer complaints involving selective surveillance and biased profiling at this location. The manager's composure cracked visibly. That is completely out of context. Context matters, Naomi replied quietly. That is why I came in person. Rain streaked slowly down the massive front windows behind her, distorting the city lights outside into blurred silver lines. Naomi finally removed her trench coat, revealing a simple charcoal sweater underneath. Nothing about her appearance looked wealthy or intimidating. That was the point. The manager stared at her now with the desperate confusion of someone trying to understand how they missed the signs. But power did not always arrive wearing diamonds. Sometimes it arrived looking tired. One executive suddenly spoke into his earpiece before turning toward the staff. Corporate legal has approved immediate suspension procedures. A quiet gasp spread through the employees. The manager's voice dropped almost to a whisper. You are shutting down the entire flagship because of one interaction. Naomi looked directly at her. No, she said calmly. I am shutting it down because none of you thought there would be consequences. The room fell silent again. Even the customers understood now. This was never about a jacket. Outside, rain continued falling against the darkened windows while inside the boutique, luxury had collapsed into fear so quietly that nobody seemed to understand exactly when it happened. Employees stood clustered near the registers whispering in low panicked voices, while compliance officers moved methodically from terminal to terminal collecting transaction records and internal communications. The elegant atmosphere the store had spent years building now felt painfully artificial, like a stage set after the audience had left. Naomi stood near the center display table reviewing documents on the tablet handed to her by one of the executives. Her damp auburn hair rested against the collar of her charcoal sweater, and the exhaustion in her face looked deeper now under the harsh white light that had replaced the boutique's warm ambient glow. She did not look victorious. She looked disappointed. That unsettled them even more. The manager remained several feet away, visibly struggling to maintain composure while customers quietly gathered their belongings under staff supervision. Ms. Mercer, she said carefully, I understand this situation appears bad, but shutting down a flagship location over employee perception issues is excessive. Naomi looked up slowly. Perception issues? The manager immediately realized the mistake. That is not what I meant. But Naomi stepped closer for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice stayed calm, almost gentle. Your staff monitored me within 30 seconds of entry. You redirected me away from premium inventory without financial verification. You isolated me socially in front of paying customers. You escalated surveillance based entirely on appearance. The manager swallowed hard. Naomi continued. That is not perception. That is documented behavior. Nearby, Emily quietly lowered her eyes. One of the compliance officers suddenly approached, holding printed screenshots from internal employee messages. We recovered store chat logs from earlier today. He handed the pages to Naomi first. The manager's face drained immediately. Naomi scanned the messages silently. Probably homeless. Watch the tote bag. Do not let her near accessories. The room became painfully still. One employee near the fitting rooms covered her mouth in shock. Another stared at the floor, unable to look at anyone. Naomi folded the papers once before handing them back. You all became comfortable saying these things because nobody corrected you, she said softly. That is how toxic cultures survive. The manager's voice trembled now despite her effort to sound controlled. I did not write those messages. No, Naomi replied. You created the environment where people believed they could. The words hit harder than shouting ever would have. A customer near the entrance slowly removed the boutique shopping bag from her shoulder and placed it on a display table before quietly walking away. Then another customer followed. One by one, people who had once admired the store's prestige began distancing themselves from it entirely. Reputation was collapsing in real time. Through the glass storefront, flashing reflections from black corporate vehicles lined the curb outside. More executives were arriving. Naomi glanced toward the entrance before speaking again. Do you know the first thing luxury brands lose before money? The manager said nothing. Naomi answered for her. Trust. The manager looked around at the silent employees, the abandoned merchandise, the locked doors, the compliance teams moving through the store like investigators through a crime scene. And for the first time all evening, she finally understood something terrifying. This was not a temporary embarrassment. Her career was ending in front of everyone. The boutique's massive digital screens shut off one by one until only the cold overhead lighting remained. Without the carefully designed atmosphere, the place suddenly looked smaller, harsher, almost ordinary. Employees who had spent years maintaining an illusion of effortless elegance now stood exposed beneath plain white light, with anxious faces and trembling hands. Naomi watched quietly as another compliance officer sealed off the executive office upstairs with an electronic lock. The sound echoed faintly through the silent building. Nobody spoke unless absolutely necessary now. Even the customers still waiting near the entrance kept their voices low as though they had wandered into something far more serious than a retail investigation. Naomi remained near the center display while reviewing the final incident summaries arriving on the tablet. Her expression never changed much, but inside, exhaustion pressed heavily against her chest. She had walked through stores like this across Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, and now New York. Different employees, different cities, same behavior, same quiet humiliation disguised as professionalism. A regional vice president approached carefully, a gray-haired man named Leonard Graves whose expensive suit now looked strangely wrinkled after hours of damage control. The board wants immediate recommendations by morning, he said quietly. Naomi nodded without looking up. You already know the recommendations. Leonard exhaled slowly. The shareholders are going to panic. Naomi finally lifted her eyes toward him. They should panic when discrimination becomes operational culture. Nearby, the manager sat alone behind the register station completing a formal incident statement with visibly shaking hands. Nobody stood near her anymore. The same employees who once mirrored her confidence now avoided even accidental eye contact. Power had abandoned her with shocking speed. Emily slowly approached Naomi holding a folded store umbrella. You forgot this earlier, she said softly, offering the umbrella Naomi had left near the entrance after coming in from the rain. Naomi accepted it with a small nod. Thank you. Emily hesitated before speaking again. Can I ask you something? Naomi looked at her calmly. Why did you come and dress like that if you knew they would judge you? The question was honest, not cruel. Naomi glanced down at her damp sneakers and wrinkled trench coat. Then she looked across the boutique where abandoned champagne glasses still sat untouched beside luxury handbags worth more than most people's monthly rent. Because people reveal themselves faster when they think someone has no power, she replied quietly. Emily absorbed the words in silence. Across the room, one compliance officer suddenly removed the boutique logo plaque from the front reception desk and placed it into an evidence case. The sight hit the employees harder than anything else so far. It felt symbolic. Final. The manager looked up from her paperwork with pale eyes. I spent 12 years building this store, she whispered weakly. Naomi studied her for a long moment before answering. No, she said softly. You built a place where people felt small unless they looked expensive. The manager lowered her head as the weight of the truth finally settled over her completely. Outside, rain continued falling across Madison Avenue, while workers quietly lifted a black temporary closure sign toward the front doors. And for the first time all night, nobody inside the boutique tried to stop them. By 9:30 that night, the rain outside had slowed to a cold mist, but inside the boutique, the tension remained suffocating. Employees sat separately now, scattered across velvet benches and empty fitting room lounges like passengers waiting for bad news at an airport terminal. Nobody touched the champagne anymore. Nobody cared about the merchandise. The illusion of exclusivity had completely evaporated, leaving only fear, embarrassment, and silence behind. Naomi stood near the front windows watching workers secure temporary black coverings over the glowing storefront logo. Her reflection stared back at her faintly through the rain-streaked glass. Tired eyes, damp auburn hair, wrinkled charcoal sweater. Nothing about her appearance suggested authority, yet every executive in the building now waited for her approval before making a single decision. Leonard approached again, holding a fresh stack of reports. We found 6 more complaints tied directly to this location, he said quietly. 3 customers threatened legal action last year. 1 employee resigned after reporting discriminatory profiling during training. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, not out of surprise, out of recognition. She had seen this pattern too many times before. And nobody acted, she murmured. Leonard looked ashamed enough to avoid answering. Behind them, the manager suddenly stood from the register area and walked slowly toward Naomi. Her posture had completely changed now. Earlier, she had moved like someone who owned the room. Now she looked smaller somehow, diminished under the white lights. I need to say something, she said softly. The compliance team paused instinctively. Naomi turned to face her. The manager's hands trembled slightly at her sides. I know what happened tonight looks terrible. Naomi said nothing. But this industry trains us to judge people immediately, the manager continued weakly. We are told to protect image, status, presentation. We are evaluated on client quality constantly. Naomi watched her carefully. And eventually, the manager whispered, you stop seeing people as people. The room fell silent again. Several employees looked down immediately because they knew she was telling the truth. Naomi took a slow breath before answering. The dangerous part is not that you judged me, she said quietly. It is that everyone around you believed it was normal. Those words settled heavily across the boutique. Emily's eyes filled with tears near the scarf display. One older sales associate quietly removed her name badge and placed it on the counter without a word. Another employee stared blankly at the marble floor as if finally seeing the environment differently for the first time in years. Naomi looked around the store one final time. She noticed details she always noticed. The mirrors positioned to encourage insecurity. The seating designed to separate wealthy clients from uncertain ones. The silent hierarchy built into every interaction. Luxury spaces rarely humiliated people loudly. They humiliated people elegantly. That was what made them dangerous. A compliance officer approached holding the final suspension authorization form. Everything is ready, he said. Naomi signed the document calmly. The scratching sound of the pen across paper seemed louder than it should have. Leonard exhaled slowly after she handed it back. Once this becomes public tomorrow morning, he said carefully, the media response is going to be brutal. Naomi picked up her umbrella and tote bag. Good, she replied softly. The answer stunned him. Naomi looked once more at the employees standing beneath the stripped-down lighting. People only change systems they are finally ashamed of. Then she turned toward the locked entrance doors while behind her, the boutique that once made others feel unworthy officially ceased operations. The temporary closure sign was finally mounted against the inside of the glass doors just before 10 o'clock. Outside on Madison Avenue, pedestrians slowed beneath umbrellas to stare at the darkened flagship boutique that only hours earlier had glowed with wealth and exclusivity. Now the front windows reflected nothing except rain, police barricades from a nearby construction site, and the uneasy faces of executives speaking quietly into phones. News traveled fast in Manhattan. By morning, everyone important in luxury retail would know exactly what happened inside these walls. Naomi stood near the entrance waiting for the final authorization seals to be applied, while employees collected personal belongings under supervision. Nobody spoke above a whisper anymore. The manager moved slowly through the store, removing framed campaign photographs from the walls, as though dismantling her own life piece by piece. Earlier, she had fought desperately to defend the boutique. Now she looked emotionally hollow. Emily approached Naomi carefully one last time. "I almost said something earlier," she admitted softly. Naomi looked at her. "When they started watching you." Emily swallowed hard. "I knew it was wrong." Naomi nodded slightly. "Most people do." Emily's eyes lowered. "Then why do they stay quiet?" Naomi glanced around the boutique. At the marble floors, the gold fixtures, the abandoned handbags still sitting beneath spotlights, no longer glowing warmly enough to feel aspirational. "Because environments train people faster than conscience does," she answered quietly. The words lingered heavily between them. Near the register, one compliance officer finished attaching evidence tags to internal communication devices, while another photographed employee surveillance policies retrieved from the upstairs office. Every elegant detail in the boutique now looked colder under investigation lights. Leonard approached Naomi holding his coat over one arm. "Corporate legal approved your recommendation package in full," he said carefully. "Terminations begin tomorrow morning." Naomi showed no satisfaction hearing it. "And the staff?" Leonard hesitated. "Mandatory bias retraining company-wide. Executive restructuring. Outside oversight for every flagship location." Naomi gave a small nod. That was the real reason she had come. Not revenge. Structural damage required structural consequences. A sudden burst of camera flashes lit the windows outside. Reporters had arrived faster than expected. Employees visibly panicked at the sight. One sales associate quietly began crying near the fitting rooms, while another covered her face with her coat to avoid being photographed leaving the building. The manager stood completely still when she saw the reporters gathering beyond the glass. "They are going to destroy me," she whispered. Naomi looked at her calmly. "No," she said softly. "Your choices did that." The manager's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. But even then Naomi did not look triumphant. Only tired. Deeply tired. She had spent years walking into beautiful places built on invisible humiliation and watching powerful people act shocked when consequences finally arrived. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above the city skyline as workers finished sealing the boutique entrance with corporate suspension notices. Naomi opened her umbrella slowly and stepped toward the doors. Before leaving, she paused for one final moment and looked back at the silent employees standing beneath stripped luxury lights. Earlier that evening they had watched her like she did not belong there. Now every person in the room understood the same painful truth at once. The quiet woman in wet sneakers had been the only person who truly belonged in positions of power all along. Naomi stepped out into the cold Manhattan night, just as another wave of camera flashes exploded across the sidewalk. Reporters shouted questions immediately, their voices overlapping beneath the sound of rain and distant traffic. "Ms. Mercer, was the store targeting customers? Will more locations be shut down? Is corporate preparing lawsuits?" Naomi did not answer any of them. She simply opened her umbrella and walked past the crowd in her damp white sneakers, while security struggled to hold the growing line of media behind temporary barriers. Behind the glass storefront, employees stood motionless beneath stripped white lights watching her leave. The black suspension notices reflected against the windows like bruises across the boutique's polished image. Naomi reached the corner of Madison Avenue and paused beneath a traffic light glowing red against the wet pavement. The city around her continued moving almost normally. Yellow taxis rolled through intersections. Couples hurried beneath umbrellas. A delivery cyclist rushed past without noticing her at all. That was the strange thing about moments like this. For the people inside the story, everything changed forever. For everyone else, New York simply kept moving. Her phone vibrated softly inside her coat pocket. "Leonard," Naomi answered after a moment. "The board just released the official statement," he said quietly through the speaker. Every major fashion publication picked it up already. Naomi closed her eyes briefly as cold rain tapped against the umbrella above her. "And the employees?" she asked first. Leonard hesitated. "Some terminations. Some probation reviews. Counseling resources. The company is trying to contain the fallout." Naomi stared across the street at the blurred reflection of luxury advertisements glowing across rain-covered windows. Beautiful faces. Perfect styling. Entire industries built around making people feel inadequate enough to buy acceptance. "Containment is not the same thing as change," she said softly. Leonard did not argue. Before ending the call, he spoke more quietly than before. "For what it is worth, you were right." Naomi looked back once toward the boutique in the distance. Workers were already removing branded displays from the front windows while reporters continued filming outside. The place no longer looked powerful. It looked fragile. "I know," she replied gently, then ended the call. A few blocks later, Naomi stopped at a small coffee shop still open near Lexington Avenue. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as she stepped inside. Nobody stared at her here. Nobody cared about her coat, her wet shoes, or the canvas tote hanging from her shoulder. A tired cashier simply smiled and asked what she wanted to order. Naomi stood there for a second longer than necessary before quietly asking for a small black coffee. As she waited near the fogged front window, she noticed two teenage girls sitting nearby scrolling through photos of the boutique shut down already spreading online. "I used to feel so uncomfortable walking into places like that," one girl admitted quietly to the other. "Me too," her friend answered. "Like they could instantly tell I did not belong." Naomi lowered her eyes toward the paper coffee cup warming her hands. Across the street, rainwater carried reflections of city lights through the gutters in slow silver streaks. She thought about Emily, about the employees who stayed silent because silence felt safer, about all the people who had spent years shrinking themselves in beautiful places just to avoid humiliation. The world rarely announced injustice dramatically. Most of the time it arrived politely, elegantly, with smiles, with lowered voices, with phrases like "private clients only." Naomi took a slow sip of coffee and stared out at the rain-covered city beyond the glass. Somewhere behind her, the espresso machine hissed softly while strangers continued ordinary conversations as if nothing remarkable had happened at all. But for at least a few people that night, something had changed permanently, and sometimes that was enough.